Good evening, and welcome once more to our quiet corner of history. I'm your host Ben, and tonight we turn our attention to a figure that has been romanticized through centuries of literature, art, and entertainment, the medieval court jester. The colourful fool in motley, with jingling bells and quick wit, entertaining kings and queens with boundless mirth. But as with many historical roles that have been polished by the passage of time, the reality of the jester's existence was far more complex, and often far more difficult than our modern imagination suggests. Behind the laughter and capering lay lives often marked by precariousness, danger, exploitation, and profound psychological burden. The medieval court jester occupied a unique position in the social hierarchy of their time. Neither noble nor common servant, but something altogether different. They walked a dangerous line between truth-teller and entertainer, between valued companion and disposable amusement. Their fortunes could change as quickly as the moods of their masters, and their talents, while celebrated, offered little protection from the harsher realities of medieval life. As we explore why it truly sucked to be a medieval court jester, we should first understand that there wasn't just one type of jester. The term encompassed several distinct categories of individuals with vastly different experiences. The professional fool was typically an educated, skilled performer who used wit, music, acrobatics, and storytelling to entertain. These individuals wore normal clothes like their masters, not the stereotypical motley and cap and bells that we associate with jesters today. In stark contrast were the natural or innocent fools, individuals with physical or mental disabilities who were kept by noble households almost as pets under the thin guise of Christian charity. These unfortunate souls were not paid performers, but exploited individuals, provided with basic necessities in exchange for being objects of amusement. A third category consisted of amateur performers, members of fool societies, particularly popular in France, who performed at festivals and fairs. These were the ones more likely to don the colourful costumes and bells that have become the jester's iconic image in our collective imagination. Tonight, as you settle in and allow the concerns of your day to gently recede, we'll explore the many hardships these diverse jesters faced. From their precarious social position and the physical dangers they encountered, to the psychological toll of their unique role and the dark duties sometimes demanded of them, we'll meet notable jesters whose stories reveal the complex reality behind the cheerful mask and consider how their legacy has been transformed over centuries. So find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow, and join me as we peel back the layers of myth to discover why, beneath the laughter and merriment, it truly sucked to be a medieval court jester. As we delve deeper into the reality of the medieval court jester's existence, let us first consider perhaps the most fundamental hardship they faced, their peculiar and precarious social position. The jester occupied a liminal space in medieval society, belonging neither to the nobility they entertained, nor to the servants who maintained the household. This social ambiguity created a unique form of isolation that few other medieval roles experienced. Unlike other servants or courtiers, whose positions were clearly defined by birth, tradition, and social hierarchy, the jester existed in a strange limbo. They might dine at the Lord's table one night and sleep on straw in a corner the next. They could speak familiarly with kings in ways that would cost others their heads, yet remained entirely dependent on the whims of those same monarchs for their very survival. This dependency was absolute and created a profound vulnerability. A jester's livelihood, reputation, and often their life itself hung on maintaining the favor of their patron. Unlike a skilled craftsman who could take their trade elsewhere if dismissed, or a farmer with land to work, jesters possessed talents that were valuable only in specific contexts and to specific audiences. To lose one's position could mean destitution or worse. The dehumanizing aspects of this relationship are perhaps best illustrated by the practice of Kings Edward II and Edward III of England, who called all their successive jesters Robert, regardless of their actual names. This casual erasure of individual identity speaks volumes about how these performers were viewed, not as complete persons with their own identities, but as interchangeable sources of amusement, defined entirely by their function rather than their humanity. For professional fools, those skilled entertainers who had trained in music, storytelling, acrobatics, and wit, there existed at least the possibility of respect for their talents. Some achieved a measure of fame and comfort, like Tom Lafol, who performed at the marriage feast of Edward I's daughter Elizabeth and received the princely sum of 50 shillings, a fortune when a skilled thatcher might earn only 2 halfpence a day. But such success stories were rare exceptions rather than the rule. Far more precarious was the position of natural or innocent fools, those with physical or mental disabilities, who were kept by noble households ostensibly as an act of Christian charity, but in reality as living curiosities. These individuals were not paid performers, but essentially captives, provided with food, clothing, and a place to sleep on the floor in exchange for being objects of mockery and amusement. Their treatment reflected the medieval attitude toward disability, not as a condition deserving of accommodation and respect, but as a divine mark that rendered the person somehow less than fully human. When these natural fools no longer amused their masters, perhaps as the novelty of their condition wore off, or as they aged, they were often simply discarded. Some of the more fortunate might receive a small pension in the form of regular alms, but many ended their days as beggars, cast out from the only home they had known with no means of supporting themselves. It was a cruel system that exploited vulnerability under the thinnest veneer of benevolence. Even for the most successful jesters, their proximity to power was a double-edged sword. They witnessed the intimate workings of courts and the private moments of the powerful, information that could be dangerous to possess. They were often privy to secrets and intrigues that, if revealed, even accidentally, could cost them dearly. This knowledge, combined with their tenuous position, created a constant state of vigilance that must have been exhausting to maintain. The jester's role as truth-teller, often celebrated in later romantic depictions, was in reality fraught with danger. Yes, they sometimes enjoyed a limited license to speak truths that others dared not utter, but this freedom was never absolute, and its boundaries were never clearly defined. A jest that amused a lord one day might enrage him the next, depending on his mood, the political climate, or simply how well he had slept. The jester had to be an expert reader of temperament and situation, constantly calculating the risk of each quip or observation. This social precariousness extended beyond the relationship with their patron. Other courtiers might resent the jester's familiar access to the lord, viewing them with suspicion or contempt. Servants might see them as neither fish nor fowl, not truly one of the nobility they entertained, yet exempt from the labor that defined servants' lives. This left many jesters without true peers or community, adding a profound social isolation to their already vulnerable position. For female jesters, and there were some, like the joculatrix Adeline who owned land in Hampshire in 1086, this social ambiguity was compounded by the gender expectations of medieval society. A woman who performed, jested, and moved freely among men occupied an even more tenuous position than her male counterparts, subject to additional scrutiny and moral judgment. Perhaps most poignant was the knowledge that for many jesters there was no path to advancement or security. Unlike a servant who might rise through the ranks, or a courtier who could gain lands and titles through loyal service, the jester's role offered little opportunity for social mobility. They remained perpetually dependent, their status never truly their own, but always a reflection of their patron's favor. This dependency created a psychological burden that few other medieval professions shared, the constant awareness that one's entire existence hung on the ability to amuse, to read the room correctly, to navigate the dangerous waters of power and personality without a single misstep. It was a precarious dance that required constant vigilance and offered little respite. As we drift away from this examination of the jester's social position, consider how this fundamental insecurity colored every aspect of their lives. The professional skills they honed, the relationships they formed, the personas they crafted, all were shaped by the knowledge that they existed at the pleasure of their patrons, with little recourse should that pleasure turn to indifference or displeasure. And what did this precarious existence look like on a daily basis? What filled the hours when they weren't performing for their lords? As we'll explore next, the reality of a jester's daily life was far removed from the constant merriment and performance that popular imagination might suggest. As we continue our exploration of the medieval court jester's difficult existence, let us turn our attention to the reality of their daily lives, a reality far removed from the constant performance and merriment that popular imagination might suggest. While we picture jesters as perpetually entertaining, capering about in colourful costumes and filling grand halls with laughter, the truth was considerably more mundane and often tedious. Contrary to popular belief, noblemen and kings did not throw lavish feasts every night, nor did they desire constant entertainment. Even the wealthiest lords would find listening to the same jester night after night tedious, and the jester themselves would quickly exhaust their repertoire of jokes, songs, and acrobatic feats if required to perform daily. Instead, jesters were called upon to entertain only occasionally, during special feasts, celebrations, or when important guests visited the household. This begs the question, what did jesters do during the considerable time they weren't performing? The answer reveals another hardship of their existence. They were expected to earn their keep through mundane household duties that had nothing to do with entertainment. Court records and household accounts reveal that jesters often served as keepers of the hounds, responsible for the care and feeding of their master's hunting dogs. Others were sent to markets to purchase livestock and provisions for the household, acting essentially as errand runners. Some worked in the kitchens or stables, performing tasks no different from those of common servants despite their special status as entertainers. For highly trained professional jesters, those who had spent years honing their skills in music, acrobatics, storytelling and wit, these menial tasks must have felt particularly demeaning. Imagine a skilled performer who could juggle knives, compose clever verses, and play multiple instruments being assigned to clean kennels or haggle over the price of chickens at the market. Yet refusing such duties was not an option if they wished to maintain their position in the household. The living conditions of jesters varied dramatically depending on their status and the generosity of their patron. The most fortunate, those rare few who had caught the particular favor of a king or powerful noble, might be granted their own quarters and servants. Tom Lefol, who performed at the marriage feast of Edward I's daughter, was richly rewarded and likely enjoyed comfortable accommodations. Similarly, Roland le Pétour, Roland the Farter, was granted 30 acres of land by King Henry II, suggesting a level of material comfort unusual for entertainers of the time. But these were exceptional cases. Most jesters lived in far humbler circumstances. Professional fools might be granted a small chamber or corner in the servants' quarters, while natural fools, those with disabilities kept for amusement, often slept on the floor of the hall or wherever space could be found. Privacy was a luxury few jesters enjoyed, as medieval households were communal spaces where personal space was minimal for all but the highest-ranking members. The daily rhythm of a jester's life was dictated by the household schedule rather than by performance opportunities. They would rise with the rest of the household, often before dawn, and retire when their duties were complete or when the hall was cleared for the night. During the day, they would be at the beck and call of their master, ready to perform if requested but otherwise occupied with whatever tasks had been assigned to them. Meals were another area where the jester's ambiguous social position became apparent. Some jesters dined at their master's table, particularly during feasts when they might be called upon to entertain. This proximity to power was unusual for someone of low birth and could inspire resentment from other servants or even courtiers. More commonly, however, jesters ate with the higher servants, occupying a middle ground in the strictly hierarchical feeding arrangements of medieval households. The clothing of jesters, another area where reality diverges from popular imagination, reflected their daily duties as much as their performance role. While we picture jesters in motley, multicolored costumes with bells and floppy-eared caps, this attire was primarily worn by amateur performers at festivals and fairs. Professional court jesters, particularly those serving kings and high nobles, often dressed in clothes similar to their masters, though perhaps of lesser quality. Their performance attire might be more elaborate, but for daily wear, practicality prevailed. For natural fools, clothing might be chosen specifically to emphasize their differences or disabilities, a cruel reminder of their status as objects of amusement, rather than respected entertainers. Some were dressed in outlandish or infantilizing ways that highlighted their perceived oddities, further stripping them of dignity and reinforcing their role as living curiosities. The tedium of waiting to perform represented another psychological burden. Jesters needed to maintain their skills through regular practice, juggling, memorizing stories, composing verses, practicing musical instruments, yet might go weeks without a formal opportunity to display these talents. This created a strange limbo where they were defined by abilities they rarely showcased, required to be perpetually ready to perform while spending most of their time on unrelated tasks. During these long periods between performances, jesters occupied an awkward position in the household social structure. Neither fully servant nor truly companion to their noble masters, they existed in a state of constant readiness, unable to fully integrate into either world. This social isolation was compounded by the knowledge that their value was measured primarily by their ability to amuse, a skill that could fade with age or changing tastes. For jesters who travelled with their masters, accompanying them to other castles, to court, or even on military campaigns, daily life included the additional hardships of medieval travel. Roads were poor, accommodations basic, and dangers numerous. While their noble patrons might travel in relative comfort, jesters would experience the full discomfort of medieval journeys, from inclement weather to poor food to the risk of robbery on unsafe roads. Perhaps most poignant was the contrast between the jester's public persona and private reality. Required to project mirth and merriment during performances regardless of their personal circumstances or feelings, jesters lived a divided existence. The fool who made the court roar with laughter in the evening might spend the morning cleaning kennels, nursing injuries from physical comedy, or worrying about maintaining favor with a fickle patron. As we drift away from these considerations of daily life, reflect on how the mundane reality of a jester's existence contrasts with our romanticized image. Far from a life of constant performance and acclaim, most jesters spent their days much like other servants, working at assigned tasks, navigating complex household hierarchies, and waiting for the relatively rare occasions when their special talents were required. And yet, even these mundane hardships pale in comparison to the physical dangers many jesters faced, dangers that extended far beyond the occasional tumble during an acrobatic performance. As we'll explore next, jesters were often placed in situations of genuine peril, particularly when their masters went to war. As we delve deeper into the hardships of the medieval court jester's existence, we must confront perhaps the most surprising aspect of their role, the very real physical dangers they faced, particularly during times of war. Far from being kept safely away from conflict, jesters were often placed directly in harm's way, serving functions that put their lives at considerable risk. When we imagine medieval warfare, we picture armored knights, archers, and foot soldiers, not the court fool in colourful garb. Yet historical records reveal that jesters frequently accompanied their masters onto the battlefield, where they performed duties that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with danger. One of the most perilous roles assigned to jesters was that of messenger between warring armies. When a city was under siege, or terms needed to be negotiated between hostile forces, jesters were often selected to carry these communications. This choice wasn't made out of cruelty, but rather practicality. The jester was immediately recognizable by their distinctive appearance or reputation, and their status as an entertainer, rather than a warrior, sometimes afforded them a measure of protection. Sometimes, however, this protection proved illusory. Historical accounts tell of jesters who were killed while delivering messages, their deaths serving as graphic rejections of the terms they carried. More gruesome still were instances where enemy forces would catapult the body or severed head of the unfortunate messenger back into their own camp as a macabre illustration of their refusal to negotiate. The phrase, "don't kill the messenger," exists for good reason. It was a very real risk that messengers, including jesters, faced. Even when not serving as messengers, jesters had battlefield roles that placed them in danger. In the early Middle Ages, jesters were expected to perform a form of psychological warfare, boosting their army's morale the night before battle with songs and stories, while simultaneously attempting to demoralize the enemy. When armies took up their positions facing each other, jesters would sometimes cavort between the lines on foot or horseback. Their purpose was twofold: to calm the nerves of their own soldiers with humor and familiar entertainment, and to provoke the opposing forces through mockery and insults. Some jesters would juggle weapons, swords or lances, in full view of the enemy, a display meant to taunt and goad hot-tempered opponents into breaking ranks prematurely. This strategy, while potentially effective, placed the jester in extraordinary danger. Positioned between two hostile armies, they became targets for arrows, spears, or impulsive charges from enraged enemy soldiers. If their own side retreated, they could easily be left behind and captured or killed. Unlike trained warriors, jesters typically had neither armor nor combat training to protect them in these situations. The physical dangers extended beyond the battlefield. Jesters, who performed acrobatics, juggled dangerous objects, or engaged in physical comedy, risked injury during every performance. Falls, burns, cuts, and broken bones were occupational hazards, made worse by the primitive medical care of the medieval period. A serious injury could end a jester's career, and without their ability to perform, they might quickly find themselves without position or protection. For jesters who specialized in physical comedy involving self-harm or pain, a popular form of entertainment in medieval courts, the cumulative damage to their bodies could be significant. Repeated blows, falls, and contortions took their toll over time, leading to chronic pain and disability. Yet, unlike modern performers who might retire when their bodies could no longer handle the strain, medieval jesters had few options but to continue performing despite their suffering. Travel with their masters exposed jesters to additional physical risks. Medieval roads were dangerous places, frequented by bandits and outlaws. While nobles traveled with armed retinues for protection, jesters, often moving ahead or separately from the main party, were vulnerable to attack. Their distinctive appearance might mark them as targets, especially if they carried valuable instruments or wore costume elements that could be mistaken for wealth. Weather posed another threat during travel. Without adequate protection from the elements, jesters faced exposure to cold, heat, and storms. Illness was a constant companion on medieval journeys, from common colds to more serious diseases spread through contaminated water and food. For jesters already weakened by the physical demands of their performances, such illnesses could prove debilitating or fatal. Even within the relative safety of the castle or manor, jesters faced physical dangers unique to their position. Their license to mock and jest sometimes extended beyond what would be tolerated from others, but this freedom had limits that were never clearly defined. A joke that went too far, a mimicry that struck too close to home, or a truth spoken too plainly, could result in violent retaliation from their master or other members of the household. Historical accounts tell of jesters being struck, whipped, or otherwise physically punished for perceived transgressions. While some nobles might value the jester's honest counsel disguised as humor, others were quick to violent anger when mocked, regardless of the jester's special status. This unpredictability created a constant physical threat that few other household positions faced. For natural fools, those with disabilities kept for amusement, the physical dangers were often compounded by mistreatment. Unable to defend themselves or fully understand the social dynamics at play, these vulnerable individuals were sometimes subjected to cruel pranks or abuse disguised as entertainment. Their physical well-being depended entirely on the conscience and restraint of those around them, protections that were far from guaranteed in the medieval period. Perhaps most disturbing were the accounts of jesters being used in what we might today call stress tests of food and drink. In courts where poisoning was a legitimate fear, jesters sometimes served as unwitting tasters, consuming potentially dangerous substances before their masters to ensure they were safe. While this practice was not universal, its existence speaks to the expendability of the jester in the eyes of some medieval nobles. The physical toll of constant readiness should not be overlooked. Jesters needed to be prepared to perform at any moment, regardless of their physical condition or needs. This meant suppressing illness, pain, hunger, or exhaustion when called upon to entertain. The strain of maintaining a cheerful, energetic persona while physically suffering represents a hardship unique to performers of all eras, but particularly acute for medieval jesters, whose very survival depended on their ability to amuse. As we drift away from these considerations of physical danger, consider how the jester's body was, in many ways, not fully their own. It was a tool for entertainment, a vessel for messages, a shield against enemy morale, and sometimes a test subject for potential threats. The physical integrity that most of us take for granted was for the medieval jester constantly compromised by the demands of their peculiar position. And yet, as we'll explore next, perhaps even more dangerous than these physical threats was the precarious line jesters walked when speaking truth to power, a role celebrated in literature but fraught with peril in reality. Perhaps the most celebrated aspect of the medieval court jester's role, and yet one of the most dangerous, was their supposed freedom to speak truth to power. Literature, and later romantic depictions have painted the jester as the one person brave enough to tell kings and nobles what they needed rather than wanted to hear. While there is some historical basis for this characterization, the reality was far more nuanced and perilous than these sanitized accounts suggest. The notion that jesters enjoyed complete freedom of speech is largely a myth. What they actually possessed was a limited license to frame criticism as humor, to disguise potentially dangerous observations within jokes, wordplay, and performances. This license was never absolute, never clearly defined, and could be revoked at any moment should the powerful individual being critiqued take offense rather than amusement. Consider the story of Triboulet, a jester in the court of King Francis I of France. When Triboulet insulted the king's wife, Francis was so enraged that he ordered the jester's execution. Only after considering Triboulet's years of service did the king offer him a choice in how he would die. Triboulet, demonstrating the quick wit that had sustained his career, replied, "Good sire, for Saint Nitouche's and Saint Ponsard's sake, patrons of insanity, I choose to die from old age." The king found this response so amusing that he commuted the death sentence to banishment, but the fact remains that a single ill-judged comment nearly cost Triboulet his life. This anecdote illustrates the precarious line jesters walked. Their value lay partly in their ability to deliver uncomfortable truths or criticisms that others dared not voice. But this same function placed them in constant danger. A jest that amused a lord one day might enrage him the next, depending on his mood, the political climate, or simply how well he had slept. The boundaries of acceptable criticism were never clearly defined and shifted constantly with the temperament of their master. For jesters, this meant developing an acute sensitivity to the moods and reactions of those around them, particularly their patron. They needed to read subtle facial expressions, body language, and social cues to determine when a joke might land well and when it might provoke dangerous anger. This constant vigilance, this perpetual calculation of risk versus reward for every quip or observation, must have created enormous psychological strain. The consequences of misjudging these boundaries could be severe. While execution was rare, physical punishment was not. Jesters who overstepped might be beaten, whipped, or imprisoned. More commonly, they would be banished from court, effectively losing their livelihood and social position in one stroke. For a professional whose skills were valuable only in specific contexts, such banishment could mean destitution or a dramatic fall in status and comfort. This precariousness was compounded by the fact that jesters often served as convenient scapegoats when powerful people needed to deflect blame or release frustration. A noble embarrassed by a political misstep might take out their anger on the jester who had previously warned them against that very action. A king facing criticism from his council might punish the fool who had voiced similar concerns in jest, demonstrating his authority while avoiding confrontation with more powerful figures. The psychological burden of this position, being valued for honesty, yet punished for it, created a unique form of cognitive dissonance. Jesters had to develop complex internal frameworks to navigate this contradiction, often adopting personas or characters through which they could express truths while maintaining some psychological distance from them. This splitting of the self, between the truth-teller and the survivor, represents a psychological hardship rarely acknowledged in romantic depictions of the role. For some jesters, the solution was to couch their criticisms in layers of ambiguity and metaphor so thick that they could always claim misinterpretation if offense was taken. Others developed repertoires of stock characters or animal fables through which they could express controversial ideas while maintaining plausible deniability. These strategies, while potentially effective, required constant mental agility and awareness, exhausting to maintain over years or decades of service. The jester's role as truth-teller was further complicated by the political intrigues of medieval courts. Powerful courtiers might attempt to use the jester as a proxy, encouraging them to voice criticisms or mockeries that served particular political agendas. Jesters who allowed themselves to become pawns in such games risked making powerful enemies, while those who refused might find themselves without allies when they needed protection. This political dimension meant that jesters needed to be not just entertainers, but astute observers of court politics, understanding alliances, enmities, and power dynamics that might not be obvious to outsiders. A jest that seemed innocent might inadvertently align the fool with one faction against another, creating enemies they never intended to make. This required a level of political savvy and social intelligence far beyond what we typically associate with entertainers. Perhaps most poignant was the isolation this truth-telling role created. By positioning themselves as observers and critics of court life, jesters often found themselves outside the normal social bonds and allegiances that sustained others. They were neither fully part of the nobility they entertained, nor aligned with the servants who maintained the household. This liminality, this existence between worlds, created a profound loneliness that few other medieval roles experienced. For natural fools, those with disabilities kept for amusement, the truth-telling aspect of the jester's role took on a different dimension. Their observations or behaviors, unfiltered by social convention due to their condition, might accidentally reveal uncomfortable truths or highlight hypocrisies that professional fools would carefully disguise in humor. This unintentional truth-telling could be even more dangerous, as these individuals lacked the social awareness to recognize when they had given offense. The romanticized image of the jester speaking truth to power contains a kernel of historical reality, but strips away the fear, calculation, and danger that accompanied this function. Far from being a liberating privilege, the limited license to criticize was a double-edged sword that required constant vigilance to wield without self-injury. As we drift away from these considerations of dangerous truth-telling, reflect on how this celebrated aspect of the jester's role was, in reality, another burden they carried, another way in which their position demanded more of them than it gave in return. The freedom to speak truth was never truly free, but rather purchased with risk, fear, and the constant awareness that a single misjudged word could end everything. And for some jesters, particularly those classified as natural fools, even this limited agency was denied, as we'll explore next in examining the exploitation of society's most vulnerable members under the thin guise of entertainment. As we continue our exploration of why it truly sucked to be a medieval court jester, we must confront perhaps the darkest aspect of this historical role, the exploitation of those known as natural fools. While professional jesters faced numerous hardships, they at least possessed agency and skills that afforded them some measure of control over their circumstances. For natural fools, however, individuals with physical or mental disabilities kept by noble households, the reality was far more grim. Medieval society viewed disability through a fundamentally different lens than we do today. Physical differences or developmental disabilities weren't understood as medical conditions deserving of accommodation and support, but rather as divine marks that set certain individuals apart. Some were viewed as touched by God, others as cursed, but all were seen as somehow less than fully human, objects of fascination, pity, or amusement, rather than complete persons deserving of dignity and respect. It was within this cultural context that the practice of keeping natural fools emerged. Wealthy families and noble households would adopt individuals with visible disabilities or cognitive differences, ostensibly as an act of Christian charity. The reality, however, was far less benevolent. These vulnerable individuals were kept primarily for entertainment, their differences, behaviors, and struggles becoming sources of amusement for their benefactors. Unlike professional jesters, who were compensated for their performances, natural fools received no payment beyond basic sustenance. They were provided with food, clothing, and a place to sleep, often just a space on the floor of the hall, in exchange for being perpetually available as living curiosities. They had no negotiating power, no ability to refuse or set boundaries, and no recourse if mistreated. The exploitation of these individuals took many forms. Some were dressed in infantilizing or outlandish clothing, designed to emphasize their differences, oversized garments, bright colors, or costumes that mimicked animals. Others were given nonsensical titles or names that mocked their condition. Their behaviors, particularly those stemming from their disabilities, were treated as performances rather than expressions of genuine needs or emotions. Perhaps most disturbing was the nature of the entertainment these individuals provided. Unlike professional jesters, who crafted deliberate performances based on skill and wit, natural fools were amusing simply by being themselves. Their manner of speaking, moving, or interacting with the world, all aspects of their disability, became sources of laughter and diversion. This wasn't performance, but exploitation of inherent vulnerability. Medieval accounts describe nobles and their guests laughing at the confused responses of individuals who clearly didn't understand the questions posed to them or at physical movements caused by conditions we would now recognize as cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, or neurological disorders. What was being mocked wasn't a character or a willing performance, but the very essence of a person unable to conform to societal norms due to their condition. The psychological impact of such treatment is difficult to fully comprehend. For those with sufficient cognitive awareness to understand they were objects of mockery, the humiliation must have been profound and constant. Even those who may not have fully grasped the nature of their situation would have experienced the disorientation and stress of environments that made no accommodations for their needs and offered no genuine human connection. Unlike professional jesters who could, at least theoretically, leave an intolerable situation, natural fools had no such option. Many had been abandoned by families, unable or unwilling to care for them, leaving them entirely dependent on their noble benefactors. Without family connections, financial resources, or marketable skills, they had nowhere else to go, and no means of supporting themselves if cast out. This dependency created a particularly cruel dynamic. Natural fools needed to remain amusing to justify their keep, yet had little control over what others found entertaining about them. If their particular differences became mundane through familiarity, or if a newer, more interesting fool became available, they might simply be discarded, their usefulness at an end. Historical records show that when natural fools were no longer wanted, their fates varied. The more fortunate might receive a small pension in the form of regular alms, allowing them some means of survival. Many, however, simply ended up as beggars, cast out from the only home they had known with no preparation for independent survival. In a society with few social safety nets and little sympathy for those unable to work, such abandonment was effectively a death sentence for many. The treatment of natural fools reflected a broader medieval attitude toward disability, one that viewed human difference not as part of natural diversity, but as spectacle. This perspective wasn't limited to the nobility. Public displays of individuals with disabilities were common entertainment at fairs and markets, where people would pay to gawk at those labeled as monstrosities or freaks of nature. What distinguished the natural fool in noble households was the pretense of charity that surrounded their exploitation. By housing, feeding, and clothing these individuals, nobles could present themselves as merciful Christians while simultaneously using vulnerable people as living entertainment. This hypocrisy added an additional layer of cruelty to an already inhumane practice. It's important to note that not all relationships between nobles and natural fools were uniformly cruel. Historical records suggest that some developed genuine affection for the vulnerable individuals in their care, treating them with a measure of kindness within the limitations of medieval understanding. These exceptions, however, don't negate the fundamentally exploitative nature of the system itself, a system that denied basic dignity and agency to people based on their disabilities. The exploitation of natural fools represents a particularly dark chapter in the history of entertainment, one that continued in various forms well beyond the medieval period. The practice of exhibiting people with disabilities for amusement persisted in traveling freak shows well into the 20th century, suggesting how deeply ingrained this form of exploitation was in Western culture. As we drift away from this uncomfortable examination of medieval attitudes toward disability, reflect on how the category of natural fool reveals the cruelest aspects of the jester tradition. While professional jesters faced numerous hardships, they at least performed by choice and with skill. For natural fools, their very existence was treated as performance, their differences as entertainment, and their humanity as secondary to their role as living curiosities. And yet, even for professional jesters, the role sometimes extended beyond mere entertainment into darker territories, areas where their unique position made them useful for purposes far removed from laughter and merriment. As we'll explore next, some jesters found themselves employed for tasks that had nothing to do with amusement and everything to do with the darker machinations of power. As we delve deeper into the reality of the medieval court jester's existence, we must confront an aspect of their role rarely depicted in popular culture: the darker duties many were required to perform. Beyond entertainment and truth-telling, jesters were sometimes employed for tasks that had nothing to do with amusement and everything to do with the shadowy machinations of power and politics. The jester's unique position, close to power yet not fully part of it, recognizable yet not bound by all social conventions, made them useful for purposes far removed from comedy. Their access to various social spheres, combined with their perceived harmlessness, allowed them to move in spaces and gather information in ways that others could not. This utility did not go unnoticed by the calculating minds of medieval politics. One of the most common darker roles assigned to jesters was that of spy or informant. Their presence at feasts, celebrations, and private gatherings rarely raised suspicion. After all, they were there to entertain. Yet, while performing, they could observe conversations, note alliances forming, or identify discontented nobles whose loyalty might be wavering. This information, reported back to their masters, could prove invaluable in the complex political landscape of medieval courts. Some jesters were sent specifically to other courts or noble houses with instructions to gather intelligence while ostensibly there to entertain. Their performances provided cover for careful observation, and their status as mere entertainers offered some protection if discovered. This espionage role placed jesters in considerable danger. If their true purpose was uncovered, they could face torture or execution as spies rather than the relatively mild punishments typically given to entertainers who gave offense. Beyond espionage, jesters sometimes served as political go-betweens, carrying unofficial messages or conducting preliminary negotiations that rulers wished to keep deniable. If such overtures were rejected or caused offense, the monarch could simply claim the jester had acted without authorization, sacrificing them to preserve diplomatic relations. This expendability made jesters useful tools in delicate political situations, but placed them in positions of extreme vulnerability. Perhaps most disturbing were cases where jesters were employed as assassins or accomplices to violence. The story of Thomas Skelton, the last professional fool at Muncaster Castle in Cumbria, provides a chilling example. According to legend, when Helwise, the unmarried daughter of Sir Alan Pennington, took a servant named Dick as her lover, one of Helwise's rejected suitors enlisted Skelton to take revenge. The jester beheaded the young man with an axe while he slept, later boasting callously about the deed. While this particular account may be embellished by centuries of retelling, historical records do confirm instances where jesters were involved in acts of violence or deception at their master's behest. Their unique access to private spaces, combined with the trust afforded to them as household fixtures, made them potentially effective agents for those with dark intentions. For jesters, these darker duties created profound moral and psychological burdens. Many likely entered the profession with aspirations of entertaining through wit and skill, only to find themselves entangled in webs of espionage, manipulation, and occasionally violence. The cognitive dissonance between their public persona as merchants of joy and their secret roles as instruments of intrigue must have been considerable. Moreover, refusing such duties was rarely an option. The same dependency that characterized all aspects of the jester's position applied here as well. They served at the pleasure of their patron and refused assignments at their peril. A jester who balked at spying or carrying secret messages might quickly find themselves without position or protection, cast out into a world where their specialized skills had limited application. The moral compromise required by these darker duties added another layer of isolation to the jester's already liminal existence. Unable to confide in others about their actions or the ethical quandaries they faced, jesters carrying these burdens would have experienced a profound loneliness. The gap between their public persona and their private reality widened with each morally questionable task, creating a split sense of self that few other medieval roles demanded. This instrumentalization, this reduction of a person to a tool for others' purposes, represents one of the most dehumanizing aspects of the jester's position. While all servants in medieval households were expected to obey their masters, most at least enjoyed the dignity of a clearly defined role with established boundaries. Jesters, by contrast, could be asked to step far outside the parameters of entertainment into territories that compromised not just their safety, but their very humanity. The darker duties assigned to jesters also exposed them to knowledge that could itself become dangerous. Privy to secrets, plots, and the less savory aspects of noble behavior, jesters possessed information that powerful people might prefer to keep buried. This created an additional vulnerability. The jester who knew too much might become a liability to be eliminated rather than an asset to be maintained. Historical accounts suggest that some jesters disappeared under mysterious circumstances, particularly during periods of political upheaval or when their patrons fell from power. While the specific causes of these disappearances are often lost to history, it requires little imagination to understand how a jester's accumulated knowledge could make them inconvenient witnesses when regimes or fortunes changed. For natural fools, those with disabilities kept for amusement, these darker duties were less common, as their conditions often made them unsuitable for espionage or complex political tasks. However, their very limitations created a different kind of darkness in their exploitation. Unable to fully comprehend the social dynamics around them or to advocate for themselves, they were sometimes present during sensitive discussions, precisely because they were assumed to be incapable of understanding or reporting what they witnessed. This assumption that someone's disability rendered them essentially invisible or non-person represents perhaps the darkest aspect of the natural fool's position. Their humanity was so thoroughly discounted that they weren't even considered worthy of the basic precaution of exclusion from sensitive matters. They existed in spaces not as persons, but as living furniture, their presence registered but their personhood denied. As we drift away from these uncomfortable considerations of the jester's darker duties, reflect on how these aspects of their role further complicated an already precarious existence. Beyond the challenges of entertainment and the dangers of truth-telling lay these shadowy functions, roles that placed jesters in moral jeopardy, as well as physical danger, that asked them to be not just performers but instruments of others' will in matters far removed from laughter and merriment. And for most jesters, these additional risks and burdens came with little additional compensation, a reality we'll explore next as we consider the economic hardships that characterized the jester's existence despite their proximity to wealth and power. When we imagine the medieval court jester, we might picture a figure adorned in colourful garments, dining at the king's table, and enjoying a life of relative comfort compared to the common folk of the era. This romanticized image suggests that proximity to power and wealth would naturally translate to economic security. Yet for most jesters, the reality was starkly different, a life of financial precariousness, despite their close association with the wealthy and powerful. The economic reality of jesters varied dramatically, creating a stark disparity between the few superstar jesters who achieved fame and fortune, and the vast majority who lived in relative poverty. At the highest end of the spectrum were exceptional cases like Tom Lefol, who performed at the marriage feast of Edward I's daughter Elizabeth, and received the princely sum of 50 shillings, a fortune at a time when a skilled thatcher might earn only 2 halfpence a day, and a goose could be purchased for 1 halfpence. Similarly, Roland le Pétor, Roland the Farter, was granted 30 acres of land by King Henry II for his unique performances, providing him with a sustainable income far beyond what most entertainers could dream of. But these success stories were rare exceptions that obscure the economic hardship faced by most jesters. For every Tom Lefol or Roland le Pétor, hundreds of jesters received minimal compensation for their services, often just food, lodging, and perhaps small gifts on special occasions. Unlike modern performers who might command set fees for appearances, medieval jesters typically had no guaranteed income beyond their basic maintenance within the household. This economic arrangement created a profound vulnerability. Without independent wealth or regular wages, jesters were entirely dependent on the continued favor and generosity of their patrons. A gift given one day might be followed by weeks or months of receiving nothing beyond basic sustenance. This unpredictability made it nearly impossible for jesters to accumulate savings or plan for their futures, leaving them perpetually one misstep away from destitution. For professional jesters, those skilled entertainers who had invested years in developing their talents, this economic precariousness was particularly galling. Despite possessing abilities that required significant training and practice, musical proficiency, acrobatic skill, memorization of stories and jokes, linguistic cleverness, they were compensated at levels far below their investment in these talents. A skilled craftsman could expect their expertise to translate into economic security. A skilled jester could not. The situation was even worse for natural fools, those with disabilities kept for amusement. These individuals received no payment whatsoever for their involuntary role as entertainment. They were provided with the bare minimum needed for survival: food, basic clothing, and a place to sleep, often just a space on the floor, in exchange for being perpetually available as objects of amusement. This arrangement wasn't employment but exploitation, with no consideration given to the economic rights or needs of the individual. Both professional jesters and natural fools faced a common economic challenge: the lack of retirement options or security for old age. Unlike some other medieval professions, where a lifetime of service might be rewarded with land, a pension, or at least the ability to train apprentices who would care for their teacher in old age, jesters had few such prospects. Their value lay primarily in their ability to perform, an ability that inevitably diminished with age, illness, or injury. As jesters aged and their physical abilities declined, making acrobatics more difficult, their voices less strong, their energy less boundless, their economic position became increasingly tenuous. Some were simply dismissed when they could no longer perform to their master's satisfaction, cast out with little or no provision for their remaining years. Others were kept on out of a sense of obligation or affection, but relegated to increasingly marginal roles within the household, their reduced status reflected in diminished accommodations and resources. The few historical accounts we have of aged jesters suggest that many ended their lives in poverty. Some received small pensions or alms from their former masters, enough perhaps to avoid starvation, but rarely sufficient for comfort or dignity in their final years. Others disappeared from the historical record entirely, suggesting they may have joined the ranks of the anonymous poor, perhaps begging or relying on religious charity for survival. This economic vulnerability was compounded by the specialized nature of the jester's skills. Unlike a baker, blacksmith, or tailor, whose abilities would be valuable in virtually any community, jesters possessed talents that were marketable only in specific contexts and to specific audiences. A jester dismissed from one noble household might struggle to find employment in another, particularly if they had been dismissed for giving offense rather than through simple economic necessity. For jesters who fell from favor or whose patrons died or lost power, the economic consequences could be devastating. With few transferable skills and limited social connections outside the household they had served, many found themselves suddenly without means of support in a society where survival depended on either productive labor or patronage. Some former jesters likely turned to begging or petty crime out of desperation, while others might have attempted to join traveling entertainment troupes, a precarious existence in itself. The economic hardship of the jester's position was further exacerbated by their liminal social status. Neither fully servant nor truly companion to their noble masters, they occupied an ambiguous position that often translated to economic ambiguity as well. While a steward or chamberlain might have clearly defined wages and perquisites, jesters often relied on irregular gifts and favors, making their economic situation perpetually uncertain. This uncertainty extended to material possessions as well. Many jesters owned little beyond their clothing, and perhaps a few performance props or instruments. Their accommodations and meals were provided by their patrons rather than purchased with their own earnings. This lack of material independence further reinforced their dependency and vulnerability. Without resources of their own, they had little capacity to weather periods of disfavor or to establish themselves elsewhere if dismissed. Perhaps most poignant was the contrast between the jester's proximity to wealth and their personal economic reality. They moved through richly appointed chambers, witnessed lavish feasts, and observed the exchange of valuable gifts and goods, all while remaining economically marginal themselves. This daily reminder of the vast gulf between their circumstances and those they entertained must have created a particular kind of psychological burden, a constant awareness of their exclusion from the prosperity that surrounded them. For female jesters, economic hardship was often compounded by the gender expectations and limitations of medieval society. Women generally had fewer economic opportunities than men, and female entertainers faced additional scrutiny and moral judgment. A female jester who lost her position might find her options even more limited than her male counterparts, with fewer households willing to employ her and greater suspicion attached to a woman traveling alone, seeking work. As we drift away from these considerations of economic hardship, reflect on how the jester's financial precariousness shaped every aspect of their existence. The need to maintain favor to ensure continued support influenced what they said, how they behaved, and the risks they were willing to take. Their economic vulnerability was not incidental to their role, but fundamental to it, a structural reality that ensured their compliance and reinforced their dependency. And beyond the material hardships of economic insecurity, lay perhaps the most profound challenge of the jester's existence: the psychological toll of a life spent performing on demand, walking dangerous lines of truth and power, and existing in a state of perpetual vulnerability. It is to these psychological burdens that we turn next. As we near the conclusion of our exploration into why it truly sucked to be a medieval court jester, we must consider what was perhaps the most profound hardship of all: the immense psychological toll this unique position exacted. Beyond the physical dangers, economic insecurity, and social precariousness lay a constellation of mental and emotional burdens that few other medieval roles demanded. At the core of the jester's psychological burden was the constant pressure to perform on demand. Unlike modern entertainers who might schedule performances and rehearse accordingly, jesters were expected to be amusing whenever called upon, regardless of their personal circumstances or feelings. This requirement to suppress one's authentic emotional state in favor of projected merriment created what psychologists today would recognize as emotional labor of the most demanding kind. Imagine being required to jest, tumble, and provoke laughter while grieving a personal loss, suffering physical pain, or experiencing fear or anxiety. The jester had no allowance for off days or personal crises. Their value lay in their ability to amuse, and that ability needed to be accessible at all times. This disconnect between inner experience and outer presentation created a profound psychological splitting that, sustained over years or decades, would take a significant toll on mental well-being. This performance pressure was compounded by the high stakes of failure. For the jester, an unsuccessful performance wasn't merely disappointing, it could be catastrophic. A joke that fell flat, a story that bored, or an acrobatic display that failed to impress might result not just in embarrassment, but in loss of favor, physical punishment, or even dismissal. Few other professions faced such severe consequences for simply having an off day. The resulting anxiety must have been constant and debilitating. Jesters would have lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, constantly assessing their master's mood, the receptiveness of the audience, and the potential risks of each jest or performance choice. This hyper-awareness, this inability to ever fully relax or be authentic, represents a psychological burden that would exhaust even the most resilient individual over time. Perhaps equally taxing was the jester's role as emotional regulator for powerful, often volatile individuals. Medieval nobles and monarchs were not known for emotional restraint or stability. Historical accounts abound with tales of rulers flying into rages, suffering deep melancholies, or making impulsive decisions based on momentary feelings. Jesters were often expected to manage these emotional states, using humor to diffuse anger, distraction to lift depression, or subtle guidance to steer their masters toward better decisions. This responsibility, being the emotional caretaker for someone who literally held power of life and death, created an impossible psychological position. The jester needed to be attuned enough to recognize dangerous mood shifts, skilled enough to intervene effectively, and brave enough to attempt intervention when others would retreat. The stress of this role, particularly when the jester themselves might be the target of the noble's displeasure, is difficult to overstate. The isolation of the jester's position added another layer of psychological hardship. Neither fully part of the nobility they entertained, nor aligned with the servants who maintained the household. Jesters existed in a social limbo that denied them true peers or community. This liminality, this existence between worlds, created a profound loneliness that few other medieval roles experienced. For professional jesters, this isolation was intellectual as well as social. Many were educated, witty individuals whose intelligence and observational skills set them apart in medieval society. Yet their role required them to channel these gifts into entertainment rather than meaningful discourse or contribution. The cognitive dissonance between their capabilities and the limited scope for their expression must have created a particular kind of frustration and alienation. The moral compromises required by the darker aspects of the jester's role, serving as spies, carrying politically sensitive messages, or even participating in acts of deception or violence, added yet another psychological burden. Many likely entered the profession with aspirations of entertaining through wit and skill, only to find themselves entangled in court intrigues that violated their personal values or ethical boundaries. Unable to refuse these darker duties without risking their position, jesters faced difficult moral choices with little support or guidance. The resulting guilt, shame, or self-recrimination would have been carried silently, as confiding in others about such matters could be dangerous for all involved. This forced complicity in actions they might personally find reprehensible created a corrosive effect on self-image and psychological integrity. For natural fools, those with disabilities kept for amusement, the psychological impact was different, but no less severe. While some may have had cognitive limitations that shielded them from fully understanding their exploitation, many would have been aware enough to recognize they were objects of mockery rather than respect. The psychological damage of being perpetually laughed at rather than laughed with, of having one's differences highlighted for others' amusement, is incalculable. Even those natural fools, who may not have fully comprehended the social dynamics at play, would have experienced the psychological effects of inconsistent treatment, lack of genuine human connection, and environments that made no accommodation for their needs or differences. The resulting confusion, stress, and insecurity would have manifested in ways that might then be further exploited as amusing behaviors, creating a cruel cycle of cause and effect. The psychological burden of living with constant uncertainty added another layer of stress to the jester's existence, never knowing if a jest would amuse or offend, if favor would continue or suddenly be withdrawn, if today's comfortable position might tomorrow become desperate poverty. This perpetual insecurity created a baseline anxiety that colored every aspect of the jester's life. This uncertainty extended to their very identity. Jesters were defined by their role rather than their personhood, valued for what they could provide rather than who they were. Kings Edward II and Edward III, calling all their successive jesters Robert, regardless of their actual names, exemplifies this erasure of individual identity. Living as a function rather than a person creates a profound alienation from self that modern psychology would recognize as deeply damaging to mental health. The cumulative effect of these various psychological burdens likely manifested in what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress, or other mental health conditions. Without modern understanding of these conditions or treatments for them, jesters would have had few resources for managing their psychological distress beyond whatever personal coping mechanisms they could develop. Some may have turned to alcohol or other substances to numb their anxiety or lift their spirits enough to perform. Others might have developed elaborate internal narratives or personas that allowed them to psychologically distance themselves from their role and its demands. Many probably experienced somatic symptoms, physical manifestations of psychological distress such as headaches, digestive problems, or chronic pain that would have further complicated their already difficult lives. Perhaps most poignant was the psychological impact of aging for jesters. As their physical abilities declined, making acrobatics more difficult, their reflexes slower, their energy less boundless, many would have experienced not just economic anxiety, but a profound crisis of identity. Having defined themselves through performance for decades, the inability to perform at the same level would have raised existential questions about their worth and purpose. For those fortunate enough to be kept on by sympathetic masters despite diminished abilities, watching younger, more energetic jesters take center stage would have created a particular kind of grief, a mourning for not just youth and vitality, but for the attention and validation that had structured their entire adult lives. This transition, difficult for any performer, would have been especially challenging in a context where alternative roles or identities were severely limited. As we drift away from these considerations of psychological burden, reflect on how the jester's role demanded not just physical courage and quick wit, but extraordinary psychological resilience. To maintain humor in the face of danger, creativity under constant pressure, and a semblance of selfhood despite functional reduction, these were remarkable feats of mental and emotional strength that deserve recognition alongside the more visible aspects of the jester's performance. And yet, despite these immense psychological challenges, some jesters managed not just to survive, but to leave lasting marks on history, their stories preserved in chronicles, artwork, and cultural memory. As we'll explore next, these notable jesters and their often tragic ends reveal in vivid detail just how precarious and difficult the fool's position truly was. Throughout our exploration of why it truly sucked to be a medieval court jester, we've touched upon various historical figures whose lives illustrate the hardships of this peculiar role. Now, let us delve deeper into some of these notable jesters and their often tragic stories, tales that reveal in vivid detail just how precarious and difficult the fool's position truly was, even for those who achieved fame and recognition. Perhaps no jester's story better illustrates the dramatic rise and fall possible in this profession than that of Geoffrey Hudson, known as Lord Minimus, or the Queen's Dwarf. Born in 1619 to average-sized parents in Oakham, Rutland, Hudson stopped growing at around 18 inches tall due to what modern medicine would identify as a pituitary condition. His small stature but perfect proportions made him an object of fascination, and at age 7 he was presented to the Duchess of Buckingham, who took him into her household. Hudson's life took a dramatic turn in 1626, when the Duchess presented him to Queen Henrietta Maria, wife of King Charles I, as an unusual gift. The presentation was theatrical. Hudson was served to the Queen in a cold pie, from which he emerged dressed in a miniature suit of armor, creating a moment of wonder and amusement that secured his position in the royal household. For a time, Hudson enjoyed a privileged position. The Queen favored him greatly, and he was not treated merely as a jester, but given an education and trained in courtly manners. He appeared in court masks, received fine clothes, and even had 2 servants assigned to him. This period represents the rare success story that we might imagine when thinking of court jesters, respected, well-treated, and enjoying the benefits of royal patronage. Yet even at the height of his favor, Hudson's position remained fundamentally exploitative. He was valued primarily for his unusual appearance rather than his personhood, kept as a living curiosity whose very existence was considered entertaining. Despite his education and courtly training, he was still expected to participate in elaborate jokes that emphasized his small stature, his body constantly on display for others' amusement. Hudson's story took a darker turn during the English Civil War. Loyal to the royalist cause, he accompanied Queen Henrietta Maria to France when she fled England in 1644. Despite his size, he served as a captain of the King's Horse and fought with noted bravery, demonstrating that there was far more to him than the amusing curiosity the court had reduced him to. In 1644, Hudson's life changed dramatically again, when, on a return voyage to England, he was captured by Barbary pirates and sold into slavery in North Africa. He spent approximately 25 years in captivity, enduring hardships we can only imagine, before finally being ransomed and returning to England around 1669. One might hope that this remarkable man, who had survived both the dangerous intrigues of court and decades of slavery, would find peace in his final years. Instead, Hudson's return to England brought new troubles. The country had changed dramatically during his absence. The monarchy had been restored, but his patron Queen Henrietta Maria had died in 1669, leaving him without protection or position. In a final cruel twist, Hudson was imprisoned in 1676 during the anti-Catholic hysteria of the Popish plot, presumably because of his Catholic faith and former royal connections. He died in prison in 1682 at approximately 63 years of age, a man who had been displayed, exploited, fought bravely, endured slavery, and ultimately died alone, his extraordinary life ending in confinement and obscurity. Another jester, whose story reveals the darker aspects of the profession, was Thomas Skelton, known as Tom Fool, the last jester at Muncaster Castle in Cumbria. Skelton is believed by some to have been the model for the Fool in Shakespeare's King Lear, suggesting he achieved some renown for his wit and performances. Yet his legacy is tainted by his alleged role in a murder that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with the darker duties sometimes assigned to jesters. According to local legend, when Hellwise, the unmarried daughter of Sir Alan Pennington, took a servant named Dick as her lover, one of Hellwise's rejected suitors, a local knight, enlisted Skelton to take revenge. The jester allegedly beheaded the young man with an axe while he slept, later boasting callously about the deed. "I have hid Dick's head under a heap of shavings, and he will not find that so easily when he awakes as he did my shillings." While this particular account may be embellished by centuries of retelling, it reflects the historical reality that jesters were sometimes used for purposes far removed from comedy, their unique position in the household making them useful tools for those with dark intentions. Whether or not Skelton actually committed murder, his association with this tale reveals how jesters could become entangled in the most sinister aspects of noble life, their moral autonomy compromised by their dependency on their masters. The story of Roland le Pator, Roland the Farter, offers a different perspective on the jester's precarious position. Roland held land in Hemmingstone, Suffolk in the 12th century, granted to him by King Henry II in return for a most unusual service. He was required to perform unum saltum et sifflatum et unum bumbalum, one jump, one whistle, and one fart, before the king each Christmas. On one hand, Roland's story might seem amusing. He received 30 acres of land for a skill most would consider crude rather than valuable. Yet consider the reality of his position. His livelihood and property depended entirely on his ability to perform this specific bodily function on demand, once a year, for the king's amusement. What if illness, age, or simply the pressure of the moment rendered him unable to perform? His entire economic security rested on something over which he had limited control, creating an anxiety that likely shadowed him throughout the year. Roland's story also illustrates how jesters were often reduced to a single defining trait or ability. In his case, a bodily function that most people would consider private or even embarrassing. This reduction of a complete human being to one unusual characteristic or skill represents a dehumanization common to many jesters' experiences, regardless of whether they were valued for physical comedy, verbal wit, or unusual appearance. The tale of Triboulet, court jester to both King Louis XII and Francis I of France, further illustrates the precarious line jesters walked. Known for his wit and license to mock even the king himself, Triboulet once went too far by insulting the king's wife. Francis I was so enraged that he ordered the jester's execution, only relenting to the extent of allowing Triboulet to choose the manner of his death. Triboulet's famous response: "Good sire, for Saint Nitouche's and Saint Pampsard's sake, patrons of insanity, I choose to die from old age," so amused the king that he commuted the death sentence to banishment. While this story is often told as an example of quick wit saving the day, it actually reveals the terrifying reality that a single misjudged joke could result in a death sentence, even for a jester who had served loyally for years. Female jesters, though less frequently mentioned in historical records, faced additional challenges due to their gender. One notable example is Mathurin de Valois, who served as fool to both Henry III and Henry IV of France in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Unlike male jesters who might rely primarily on wit or physical comedy, female jesters often had to navigate complex gender expectations and potential sexual exploitation alongside the usual challenges of the role. Mathurin achieved significant influence at court and was known for her sharp intelligence rather than any physical disability or unusual appearance. Yet her position remained precarious. When an assassination attempt was made on Henry IV in 1594, she was initially suspected of involvement simply because she happened to be present, illustrating how quickly a jester could move from favored entertainer to dangerous suspect. The stories of these notable jesters, Geoffrey Hudson, Thomas Skelton, Roland Le Pétour, Triboulet, Mathurin de Valois, and others, reveal a common thread of vulnerability, despite their varying degrees of fame and favor. Each achieved some measure of recognition that preserved their names in historical records, yet each also experienced the fundamental precariousness that characterized the jester's position. What particularly poignant is that for every named jester whose story has survived in some form, hundreds or thousands of others lived, suffered, and died in obscurity, their hardships unrecorded, their talents forgotten, their humanity reduced to a function that ceased to matter once they could no longer perform it. These unnamed jesters, particularly the natural fools, exploited for their disabilities, represent the silent majority of those who endured the difficult reality behind the romanticized image. Even those jesters fortunate enough to be remembered by history rarely enjoyed happy endings. Geoffrey Hudson died in prison, far from the royal favor he once enjoyed. Triboulet, despite his quick wit saving him from execution, still faced banishment, a devastating punishment for someone whose entire identity and livelihood were tied to his court position. Others disappeared from historical records at moments of political upheaval, suggesting endings too unremarkable or too dark to be recorded. These stories serve as powerful reminders that proximity to power was never the same as possessing it. Jesters might dine at the king's table, receive valuable gifts, or even influence royal decisions through well-timed jests, but they remained fundamentally dependent and vulnerable, their fortunes tied inextricably to the whims of those they entertained. As we drift away from these considerations of notable jesters and their often tragic ends, reflect on how their individual stories illuminate the broader hardships we've explored throughout this narrative. The precarious social position, the physical dangers, the burden of truth-telling, the exploitation, the darker duties, the economic hardship, and the psychological toll. All these aspects of the Jester's difficult existence are embodied in the lives of these historical figures. And as we prepare to conclude our exploration, consider how these real lives contrast with the sanitized, romanticized image of the Jester that has been passed down through centuries of literature, art, and entertainment, an image that obscures the genuine suffering behind the motley and the bells. As our journey through the difficult reality of the medieval court jester's existence draws to a close, let us take a moment to reflect on the stark contrast between the romanticized image that has been passed down to us and the harsh truth we've uncovered. The colourful fool in motley, with jingling bells and quick wit, entertaining kings and queens with boundless mirth, bears little resemblance to the complex and often tragic figures who actually occupied this peculiar role in medieval society. Throughout our exploration, we've peeled back layers of myth to reveal a position defined by precariousness, danger, exploitation, and profound psychological burden. We've seen how jesters occupied a liminal social space, neither servant nor noble, neither fully included nor entirely excluded, that created a unique form of isolation. We've examined the physical dangers they faced, from battlefield roles to the risks of speaking truth, to volatile and powerful individuals. We've confronted the exploitation of natural fools, individuals with disabilities kept for amusement under the thin guise of charity, and the darker duties that some jesters were required to perform, from espionage to assassination. We've considered the economic hardship that characterized most jesters' lives despite their proximity to wealth and power, and the immense psychological toll exacted by a role that demanded constant performance regardless of personal circumstances. Through the stories of notable jesters like Geoffrey Hudson, Thomas Skelton, Roland Le Petor, and Triboulet, we've seen how even those who achieved fame and recognition remained fundamentally vulnerable, their fortunes tied inextricably to the whims of those they entertained. And we've acknowledged the countless unnamed jesters who lived, suffered, and died in obscurity, their hardships unrecorded, their talents forgotten, their humanity reduced to a function that ceased to matter once they could no longer perform it. What emerges from this examination is not just a correction of historical misconception, but a deeper understanding of how power operates through seemingly benign cultural institutions. The jester, often portrayed as a figure of freedom and truth-telling, was in reality among the most constrained and vulnerable members of medieval society, their apparent license to speak freely, an illusion that could be revoked at any moment with devastating consequences. This is not to say that there was no joy or artistry in the jester's role. Many surely took pride in their performances, found moments of genuine connection with their audiences, and perhaps even experienced the satisfaction of successfully delivering difficult truths through the vehicle of humor. Some, like Tom Le Fol or Roland Le Petor, achieved material success that would have been impossible for them in other professions. These positive aspects existed alongside the hardships, creating a complex reality that resists simple categorization. Yet the balance of evidence suggests that for most who occupied this role, the hardships outweighed the benefits. The constant anxiety of maintaining favor, the physical dangers, the exploitation, the economic insecurity, and the psychological burden of perpetual performance created an existence that few would choose if given genuine alternatives. When we say it sucked to be a medieval court jester, we speak not with modern judgment, but with recognition of a difficult historical truth. The sanitization of the jester's image began even in the late medieval period, as literature and art began to romanticize the fool as a figure of wisdom and privileged honesty. Shakespeare's fools, articulate, insightful, and often serving as the moral compass of the plays in which they appear, contributed significantly to this idealized portrayal. Later periods further softened the reality, transforming the vulnerable, exploited jester into a symbol of licensed rebellion and truth-telling power. This transformation tells us something important about how societies process their own histories. The uncomfortable realities of exploitation, cruelty, and power imbalance are gradually obscured, replaced with more palatable narratives that allow us to enjoy the colorful aspects of the past without confronting its darker dimensions. The jester becomes a cheerful stock character rather than a person navigating an almost impossible social position. By recovering the difficult reality behind the myth, we do more than correct a historical misconception. We acknowledge the humanity of those who occupied this role. We recognize that behind the performances, the jokes, and the acrobatics were real people with hopes, fears, pain, and dignity. People who, like Jeffrey Hudson, might show remarkable courage when given the opportunity. People who, like many natural fools, endured exploitation with no choice in the matter. People whose lives mattered beyond their ability to amuse. As we drift toward sleep, perhaps we can carry forward this more nuanced understanding, not just of jesters specifically, but of how power and entertainment have intersected throughout history. The next time we encounter the cheerful jester in a film or novel, we might remember the complex reality behind the motley and bells, and in doing so, honor those whose difficult lives have been obscured by centuries of romanticization. The medieval court jester reminds us that proximity to power is not the same as possessing it, that apparent freedom can mask profound constraint, and that entertainment has often come at the expense of the vulnerable. These are lessons that extend far beyond medieval courts into our own time, inviting us to look more carefully at the entertainers and truth-tellers of our own era and the power dynamics in which they operate. As the fire burns low and our exploration concludes, I hope you carry with you not just historical knowledge, but a deeper empathy for those whose stories have been simplified or sanitized by the passage of time. In recovering the difficult reality of the medieval court jester, we honor the complexity of lives lived in the margins of power, lives that mattered then, as they matter now, beyond their utility or entertainment value to others. Rest well, and perhaps dream not of the romanticized jester of fairy tales and Renaissance fairs, but of the real human beings who navigated an impossible position with whatever courage, wit, and resilience they could muster. In acknowledging their struggles, we recognize a piece of our shared humanity that transcends the centuries between their world and ours.